Good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Carolina Albernas. I'm the Director of Business Development Operations at the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce. And on behalf of the BCC, I would like to thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank our sponsors, our platinum sponsors, Vale and Copa Airlines, our gold sponsors, EGC and McCarthy Tetro, and our silver sponsors, Brookfield, Votorantim, Samer Cement, and KPMG, and our partners, Global Affairs Canada, the Consulate General of Brazil in Toronto, the Brazilian Embassy in Ottawa, and the Ontario government for their support. This event wouldn't be possible without their help. I'd also like to thank our volunteers for all the hard work, and the members of the Brazil-Canada Trade Investment Committee for the support, the inputs, and the insights to make this event possible. And the program, everybody should have got a copy. All the bios for the speakers, the complete bios, are on the little booklet. So without further ado, I'd like to call Peter Hawkins, Managing Director for Mellowhawk Logistics and our past Vice President, to do the opening remarks. So thank you.
Carolina, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see all you folks here. In my opening remarks, all I really want to say is that Brazil is a priority market for this government, and it's a priority market for the next government. And something that we have always been concerned about is sometimes a government change looks challenging. And whenever there are challenges, there are opportunities. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that with change comes opportunity for business. And that's what we're here about. We're here to talk about how to develop greater business ties between Canada and Brazil. I also want to recognize some of the people who are here. And we are very lucky to have members from our fine sponsors like Copa Airlines and McCarthy Tetro and Vale. And I also want to make it very clear that EDC is here supporting us. We're really grateful for that. And Brookfield, Votorantim, and of course the Embassy of Brazil in Ottawa, the Consulate General of Brazil in Toronto, and of course Global Affairs Canada. And my opening remarks are pretty limited because we have a very special guest. And that special guest is the new ambassador of Canada to Brazil, Jennifer May, who you can see here. And Jennifer and I don't know each other. And I tried to do some research on her, and she has an interesting history in security. And her profile online is barely there, but I was able to find some stuff. So, she has an education in political science and German, not to mention a plethora of other foreign languages. She joined External Affairs in 1990, and she has served as Executive Director of Defense and Security Relations, Director of Eastern Europe and Eurasia Relations in various positions in the Southern and Northern Europe Relations Directorates. She served in Bonn, Hong Kong, Beijing, Vienna, Bangkok, and most recently as Deputy Head of Mission in Berlin. And now, may I present Madam Jennifer May, our new Canadian Ambassador to Brazil.
Thank you very, very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. That's the joys of technology. I wish I could be with you personally, and I certainly hope to the next time that you have a seminar to find a way. And I know that other members of my team here in Brazil are going to be joining you for the discussion in the panel later on. So thank you very, very much. This is, I'm not intentionally hiding my background, and if anybody wants to ask any questions or get in touch, I'm happy to anytime. I've started to joke that most of my career has been brought to you by the letter B, and as was pointed out, various postings, most of which have begun with that letter, but that's not the only reason that I'm in Brazil, of course. And I'm delighted to be here because this is a major relationship. It's a challenging one in some respects. As indicated, every relationship has its own peculiarities, and this is one that I'm delighted to be jumping into and really working on. In terms of the business relationship here, it's really very, very impressive what is going on. I've been on the ground now for six weeks. And in that time, I have seen a lot of very serious business interest here and a lot of potential. We've got, as you know, and as many of your sponsors are very, very active here on the ground, but there's a whole other wave of businesses that are coming in and that we're really active in supporting as well. Just in the past week, we've had a very, very significant delegation of educational institutions looking at everything from language training to higher education, whether it's at colleges or universities, as well as vocational and professional training for corporations. We have right now still here a nanotechnology delegation, and I met with them on the first day. They're looking to partner with Brazilian companies and institutions. I said, okay, so for each of you, what does success look like? What are you looking to get out of this particular week? I'm not talking about a year or two down the road. I'm talking about right now, what brought you here. What was very, very impressive is that having spoken now to members of the team who were with the delegation over the week, is that for each of those companies, all of them have found that their expectations have really been, it's gone above and beyond. That they're finding partnerships, they're finding investors, they're finding complementary companies that they can work with. It's just proving really, really incredible. So my key message that I wanted to leave you with is that we're here to partner with you. Whatever it is you want to do, we're here to help you find the way and to do it in the most efficient way possible. That we are only a phone call away, a video conference, whatever it is, but that please don't let distance be a factor. We really want to help you. So thanks very much.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador May, for your words. We're very looking forward to working very close to you and your trade commissioners on the ground and keep the work that we've been doing for the past years. And we wish you a great stay in Brazil and that we can do a lot of business together. So on behalf of the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce, thank you so much for your time and for those words. And I don't know if anyone has any questions to the ambassador, since we have her here last minute on the spot. No? So I would like to thank you again. Thank you so much, and thank you for being here today.
E obrigada a vocês.
Obrigada. So I would like to introduce you now to our next speaker and one of our sponsors. Laura Marin is the sales manager for Canada at Copa Airlines. Copa, hello? Copa has been a very trustful partner to the Chamber for many, many years and a big supporter. They've been sponsoring events for a long time, many, many years, yeah. And I'll let Laura tell you a little about Copa Airlines and their great services to Brazil. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Bom dia. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. As Carolina was saying, we've been actually very proud to be sponsoring the Brazil-Canada Chamber of Commerce for about 8 years already. So we are an airline, for those of you who don't know us or who haven't flown with us. We fly 5 times a week from Toronto to Panama City, and from there you connect to pretty much Central South America, the Caribbean, and obviously Brazil. Our connections, for example, to Rio and Sao Paulo is just 1 hour, and when you fly with us and you go through Panama, you don't have to go through customs or immigration. You just go basically from one gate to the other. We offer complimentary hot meals, alcoholic beverages, one complimentary piece of luggage, so pretty much like you are at home when you fly with us. And also we've won the most on-time airline in the world for the stats that were done in 2018, and we were awarded that by OAG this year. So we're very proud of that. So you know that if you're going for business or for a meeting, you will be arriving there on time. Also, our completion factor, which is from the flights that we actually publish to the ones that actually take off, is 99%, which means we don't really cancel flights unless there's something really of an emergency. So you will be for sure there. Anyway, I don't want to take a lot of your time, but please, give us a try. We're part of Star Alliance, so you can accumulate or redeem your points when you fly with us. Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Linda, for all your support throughout the years. So I would like to introduce you to our next speaker, Ms. Catherine de Carrier, Vice President, Channels and Marketing at Export Development Canada. Ms. de Carrier mandates at the core of how EDC serves Canadian companies as they grow their business internationally. From identifying opportunities to better meet the needs of customers and overseeing EDC's portfolio of Canadian small and medium-sized exporters, her responsibilities also included elevating awareness of EDC by engaging with customers, banks, and partners to facilitate trade-related business opportunities. Please welcome Catherine de Carrier.
Thanks very much, everyone, and good afternoon to you. It's an absolute delight to be here today with you in Toronto for this very important event, and how spectacular that the new ambassador could join us this afternoon for a few remarks. So as Carolina mentioned, my name is Catherine de Carrier, and I'm the Senior Vice President for what we call Channels and Marketing at Export Development Canada. But what that title doesn't tell you is that I'm also EDC's executive sponsor for Brazil, for that particular market. And I have been in that position for the past 3 years. So in that particular capacity, what I do is I really weigh in on key corporate decisions at EDC that relate to Brazil and our engagement in that market. Certainly I travel to the country on a regular basis, try to keep up to date on what's happening there, and also work with Canadian companies and their Brazilian buyers in markets. It's part of my job that I really enjoy, and I certainly can say that having had the opportunity to speak with some of you this afternoon about your business in Brazil, that's also been very enriching for me in that capacity as a sponsor for that market for EDC. Certainly, as everyone here in the room knows, the last few years in Brazil, it's been both an exciting and also fascinating time to be the market sponsor because the country certainly is both of these, exciting and fascinating. And I see some nodding heads around the room, so I can tell that you relate to those particular observations. But I would have to say that the Brazilian market also presents tremendous opportunities, and I know that that's why we're all here this afternoon. So, and with tremendous opportunities, sometimes come significant challenges, and that's something that we need to be aware of as well. But before we talk too much about those opportunities and challenges, if I could take just a moment to share with you a bit about EDC, because I think it's maybe helpful to understand what we do as an organization and how we could help you in your business activities, whether they be in Brazil or elsewhere around the world. So EDC is actually Canada's export credit agency, and we turned 75 years old this year. I have not been there for the full 75 years. Our mission has been the same over that entire period, and it's really to grow and develop Canada's exports around the world. We do this with a tremendously wide variety of products and services. Those range from financing, insurance, bonding, investments, and we also provide expertise and knowledge, which can be especially critical for smaller or medium-sized businesses who are taking on the challenge of doing business around the world. And while our customer base does include, of course, some of Canada's largest multinationals by a vast margin, the majority of our customers actually are smaller and medium-sized companies, like so many of the businesses represented around the room here with us today. And in fact, last year in 2018, almost 70% of our 13,000 customers were small businesses. And these are companies that do business literally all around the world. In fact, last year, EDC helped Canadian companies in more than 160 countries globally, and we facilitated more than $100 billion in Canadian trade and investments. So we've been at it for a long time, and we do it at volume. Of course, one of those countries was Brazil, and that's why we're all here this afternoon. It's a very important market for Canada and a very important market for EDC, and that's the reason why I'm here with you today as well. In fact, our relationship as an organization with the country, with Brazil, actually goes back over 50 years now. We did our first financing transaction there in the mid-1960s, and since then, really, there has been no looking back. And if we take a look at 2018, in terms of our engagement in that particular market, we served actually 335 Canadian companies who were doing business in Brazil and facilitated $2.6 billion in business in that market. You certainly don't do that kind of business in a country without learning a tremendous amount about it and about how to do business in the market. We've been a long-time believer as an organization in the potential, the enormous potential that Brazil holds for Canadian companies. In fact, it was almost 20 years ago in the year 2000 that we opened our second, at that point, international representation, which was actually located in Brazil. It was in Sao Paulo. And then 4 years after that, we opened a second location in Rio de Janeiro. We find actually that by having people on the ground in the market, we've been further able to develop really strategic relationships and partnerships with major buyers, many of whom are in key sectors that are actually aligned with Canadian expertise. So the result has been an extensive network of contacts that we have at EDC, contacts that Canadian companies can leverage when looking to expand into this particular market. So we are, in other words, really building connections between Canada and Brazil. And certainly as we talk to Canadian companies, we hear time and again that getting that first connection can actually be one of the most difficult and expensive challenges that they face. That's especially true for those smaller or mid-sized companies that we work to support and who may not actually have the resources to really travel the world meeting with potential buyers. So this is something that EDC, working with other partners in the trade ecosystem in Canada, for example, the Trade Commissioner Service, can actually really help Canadians with, and something I think we'll be talking more about today during the panel conversations. But of course, just getting a trade connection is really only one of the challenges. It's a significant one, but it's really only one of them. Because as exciting and dynamic as Brazil is, it's also, as you all know, very complex. And I'm sure that many of you have experienced that firsthand. In some regards, the bureaucracy can be difficult to navigate. And of course, there's an element of political uncertainty today that we're all experiencing. At the same time, there are considerable strengths in the Brazilian market that should be considered by Canadian companies who are thinking about doing business there. Brazil has a very solid institutional framework, a tightly regulated banking system, and a diversified economy and export base. There are also structural reforms, as I'm sure you're aware, that are currently underway. These include in the realms of labor, with respect to pensions and taxation, all of which are aimed at making the country more business friendly. We also know, and I've certainly seen this firsthand of my many trips to Brazil in the last 3 years, that the country has really taken significant measures to improve transparency within government and to protect against future incidents of corruption. These are very promising indications of where Brazil is heading. And beyond this, there's also considerable headway being made between our countries with respect to trade agreements. And preferential access to Brazil and other countries would certainly be a boon for Canadian companies looking to expand into the Latin American market. For these reasons and more, there is definitely a lot to be excited about with respect to Brazil. The country offers significant opportunities to invest and grow, especially in sectors such as transportation, infrastructure and environment, natural resources, and the extractive sector. There are risks, of course, but that is one of the many areas where EDC can be your partner and your ally. There are also lots of success stories. I'd like to take just a moment to highlight a couple of these to encourage those who are contemplating doing business in Brazil, but perhaps holding back because of concerns of some of the challenges. For example, Brookfield, one of the sponsors of this event, is doing tremendous work in Brazil across a number of sectors, and quite a trailblazer actually in the market. We also have a few customers represented here today who have been very active in the market. Peter spoke earlier to us. I'm sure we'll hear from him again later on in the program.
Because he doesn't shut up.
I won't repeat that, Peter, not from the podium. But I think Mellow Hawk Logistics, Peter's company, is one that's certainly worth highlighting. So as you probably know, they're an international freight forwarding company, and Peter will be on one of the panels later this afternoon. They've used some of EDC's credit insurance tools, some of which are available now online, to ensure increasingly larger deals with Brazilian agents. So Peter, if I recall correctly, that started off probably with deals in the $10,000 range, which perhaps kept you and others at the company up at night, even at those levels. But with the support of EDC and the insurance coverage that we've been able to put in place to support Peter and his company, they're now tackling transactions that are much larger, deals in the 75,000 plus range. And so, as you can see, while there are risks there are also mitigants that can be put in place to help companies like Peter's feel more comfortable about taking on those challenges, but actually taking on greater reward at the same time and greater opportunity. And then there's Macro Engineering, a global supplier of systems, components, and services for value-added films and sheets. And they've used actually EDC's staff on the ground to really help with networking and connections in the market. And in the last 20 years, they've actually done over $40 million worth of business in Brazil, all backed by EDC as a credit insurer. It's really helped them to establish their leading market position within the country for high barrier, long life shrink packaging for fresh meat. So 2 spectacular success stories of folks here in the room with us today. So today what I'm really urging you to do, in addition to listening to the panels and getting all the great expertise and insights that you can from the panel conversations, I really encourage you to find people in the room who have these kinds of success stories of having taken on the challenges in this market and having reaped the rewards and the opportunities. Because there are successes in the room. Talk to them, talk to each other, share ideas and experiences. In today's economy, I think we'd probably all agree that knowledge really is king. There's certainly plenty of it in this room to go around, and I hope you'll all take advantage of it this afternoon. So thanks so much for listening. I hope you have a great day, and I'm really looking forward to having more conversations with many of you before the program is over. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Carolina, can you tell her about those?
Those are brigadeiros, the Brazilian treats.
Are they from Mary's? Yes. Okay, folks, just a novelty here. I know, I don't shut up. So these are Mary's brigadeiros. They're delicious. They're like Brazilian fudge. But here's the cool thing. On Dragon's Den this week, Mary's company is on there. Just have a look and see what happens. Okay?
She's doing amazing, yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine, for your words. And so today we have 2 very interesting panels. So for the first one, I would like to invite our moderator, Andrea Gardea, Senior Economist, South America, for the Economic and Political Intelligence Center at EDC. And in addition to advising EDC customers, business teams, and senior management on country risk and international transactions, Andrea provides expert analysis of global economic issues and international business opportunities. She has extensive experience forecasting and analyzing a broad array of economic and political indicators, and is a lead contributor to EDC's Country Risk Quarterly, a comprehensive report on risks and opportunities of doing business in Brazil, in Europe, Asia, Africa, Middle East, and the Americas, including key insights on payment experiences and risk rating drivers. And in addition to country responsibilities, Andrea leads the Country Risk Rating Committee, the approving body at EDC for country risk ratings. And to join her, I would like to invite Dr. John Welch, economist specialized in Latin America, with a PhD from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a member of our board. John was also our chair and vice chair for a period of time. Chris Garman, managing directors for the Americas at Eurasia Group, and Luis Hurtado, director LATAM FICC strategy at CIBC World Markets. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panelists for the Brazilian Economic and Political Outlook panel.
Is this thing on?
So we have to just make sure it's on.
Hello.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or boa tarde a todos. I hope I said it properly. More of a Portuguese than a Portuguese. And so thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this panel with such a distinguished group of speakers.
And thank you for joining us for what I expect to be a highly dynamic and hopefully informative hour and a half, really discussing the economic and political outlook in Brazil. You know, the news does provide us with a lot of information, but sometimes you have to weed through it a little bit to understand how to view the risks, and in turn, how to benefit from that knowledge in doing business and investing in a market like Brazil. So thank you, John, Chris, and Luis for joining me today. And so what better way to start than really to contextualize what's happened in Brazil thus far. It's been a very interesting few years in Brazil. And so going into this year, Brazil was still facing some corruption investigations, facing tepid growth and a global environment that really started to see some slowing down. And at the same time, the outlook was actually quite bright for Brazil. The country was coming out of multiple years of recession. There was a change in government that was bringing an optimism to what could change in the business environment. And I think that understanding those two things at once, I would really like to start with that context. And so if I could ask the panelists to give your views on what has happened or what has gotten us here from an economic and political perspective, given that we had an election and with a new government that had a quite ambitious reform agenda moving forward. So Luis, if I could ask you to kick off the conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. As Andrea mentioned, you know, Brazil is coming out of a recession. 2015 and 2016 were really hard for the Brazilian economy. 2017 and 18 we saw slow growth, but not as much as the market would have thought. When I talk to clients, I tend to focus on what the market is expecting versus what is actually happening. In Brazil this year, the market was surprised by the announcement of and progress in the fiscal reform. The pension reform was recently approved by the lower house, and now we're waiting for the final vote in the Senate. But that's one positive point surprising the market. The other ones are what is coming after this, right? You have tax reform, you have the trade opening, you also have other microeconomic reforms coming down the pipeline. Now, that has allowed the central bank to also lower rates, which gives the economy, domestic and international firms, lower access to credit in terms of the cost of borrowing. Now, it has also managed to control inflation. The inflation forecast from the central bank is below the target range for the next 3 years. So that's another positive point that we have seen in the market so far this year. On the negative side, we have seen some concerns with regards to the exchange rate. We have seen it testing the 420 mark. Here, the market, from our clients' perspective, they're expecting some sort of central bank guidance going forward. We, on our own forecast, we don't expect that to happen too much, especially if we have the trade opening happening. Brazil comes from a low base. If you do compare it to other countries in the region, total exports as a percentage of GDP in Brazil are 13%. If you compare it to Chile, Peru, they're above 20. If you compare it against Mexico, Mexico is closer to 40. So a lot of room to grow there at that point. Now, if we move on to the risk for this year, you have what's going to happen with growth. Is that going to affect the reforms going forward? You also have the global environment, the disputes between the US and China. And you also have some negative spillovers coming from the Argentine election. So those 3 points are key to watch going forward.
And I think that the elections that came with a new government starting in January, Chris, I would really like your views on how you saw impacting the economy, and also what we could expect out of this new government that has now been in office for about 9 months.
Well, thank you very much. It's a tremendous pleasure to be able to be here and such a fantastic panel. Let me lower this a little bit. Let me just a couple quick thoughts here. Maybe to answer your question, I can separate my initial comments in what's the good news and what's the bad news.
That's right. Please do.
I mean, if you think about what's the good news, the good news is that when we look at what's been going on in Brazil the past couple of years, the agenda that is emerging in this new administration, I think there's a very strong case to be made that Brazil today probably is the most ambitious reformist story of any emerging market economy, period. Right? I mean, the reforms began under President Michel Temer, approving a constitutional cap on spending, approving a new round of labor reform. Bolsonaro got elected on this anti-establishment platform, campaigning against the political class on the platform of corruption and security. He continues to embark and defend that narrative. He continues to campaign against the political class. He does not have any love in the Brazilian Congress. This is an administration that will never create a working majority in Congress. But at the same time, what is really interesting is that due to self-interested behavior of party leaders in Congress, and in part coming out of an election where half of the lower house didn't win re-election, only a quarter of senators won re-election, they've come to the conclusion that defending market-friendly reforms is in their individual self-interest. So reforms are moving forward even though this administration is not creating a working coalition in Congress. That's what's new, right? And I'll tell you that we become more optimistic over the prospect of this broad agenda now in comparison to, back in January, February. Congress is about to deliver a pension reform, conclude voting on a more ambitious proposal than anyone thought possible. I'm speaking with party leaders. I'm thinking that a comprehensive tax reform that creates a national value-added tax of unifying federal, state, and local taxes is very much within play, close to likely, not yet. We have all the microeconomic reforms that are in the bucket, opening the oil and gas sector, logistics infrastructure, telecommunications, financial services. That agenda is a good agenda. The administration is kind of opening the economy by reducing tariffs. The privatization agenda is slow, but will have steady progress. And despite kind of difficult politics, this can move forward, and we can talk about that. The bad news is the following, right? The administration was making the case to Congress. If you deliver a broad-based pension reform, we'll plug our major fiscal vulnerability, generate conditions for an economic rebound, and then we can focus on the good productivity reforms. Right? Well, the problem is growth isn't coming. All growth forecasts have been revised downwards. There's a big question mark what's going to happen next year. And oh, by the way, pension reform isn't enough. We need to deliver a new round of fiscal reforms that require constitutional changes in order to be able to comply with the spending cap. We think that there are conditions. Our assessment of our team in Brasilia is that there probably is a path forward. They need to get this fixed by middle of next year because the 2021 budget you can't execute under current rules. We can talk about that here. And I think that Congress will probably give them enough room to punt for a couple years. But the risk is the following. If growth does not rebound next year, the political risk is the following. If growth doesn't rebound next year, and we're stuck in 1.5 GDP growth, double-digit unemployment, and these legislators coming out of this anti-establishment wave election, and they're trying to figure out how to navigate in this new environment because the government isn't giving them resources, voters are angry at politicians, and if growth doesn't come, public frustration may grow, and then they may start to panic, okay? This is a more reformist Congress. I don't think that goes away, right? It doesn't go away, but it makes kind of following up on this fiscal reform agenda more difficult. If you take a couple steps backward on fiscal, all this good news is coming out of tax, trade opening, privatizations may not shine as much, and so this virtuous cycle may be partially slowed down. Again, I think the bar is low. All you have to do is grow 2% so politicians see an upside, right? But I think I think the politics may very well flow from growth over the course of next year.
Well, the interconnectedness, I think at this point, we know you can't be disconnected.
Yeah.
One flows into the other. And John and Chris actually mentioned it a couple times, privatization, and that was a huge topic as part of the Temer administration and now with this new administration. And so I would like your views on, well, any of the topics touched on here, but also on your privatization, just touching on your article on the Americas Quarterly as well.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It was really nice to be here again. Great colleagues here on the panel. Those of you who have seen me speak before at this event knew that somewhere about 3-4 years ago I became quite negative, and I was trying to be careful with my language at the time. 2 years ago and last year with Canute, my view was different. And it had to do with the very good exposition we've heard before and here. You know, I think politeness tells us to say, when we don't want to say something bad, we say uncertainty. But actually, the prior administration, before Temer took over, there was no uncertainty at all. We knew the policies were bad and they were going to give us a bad outcome. It wasn't really difficult. The thing is, when Temer took over, then there was a huge amount of uncertainty. But when you have more uncertainty and risk, then you have probabilities, positive probabilities on positive outcomes. And that's exactly what happened. The direction changed massively before, even before the impeachment, et cetera. And we got, as Chris and Louise already said, we got some pretty good policy there. The spending cap was an incredible thing. In Brazil, for most of the last 60 years, budgets are fictions. Before it was the monetary budget during the military government. In this one, basically you have these projections for revenue, and then because of the budget law, you had to stay within revenue projections. But if the expenditures became above that, well, then they just changed the revenue projections, and you didn't really have any choice between. The spending cap forces Congress to say, if we want to have this, we can't have this. And we've heard sort of every once in a while these attacks and trying to get around and stuff like that. But so far, the backlash after that happens is quite good. And again, I think that contributed to this sort of dynamic that Chris has described in Congress. Chris has heard this one before, and so has Louise. I have a little bit of OCD, and it has to do with calling this a pension reform. This is Social Security reform. There is no money in a pension plan or a deposit like you have here in Canada. This is purely pay as you go. Everything is pay as you go. The public sector part of it, the private sector part of it, there is no money there. And even like we're talking about unfunded pensions in the United States, well, there's some money there. It's just not enough to cover what the retirees are coming. This is purely and simply, and we've been talking about it ever since the Constitution in 1988 because it was very clear that this is completely unsustainable. We got very close to having. How can you have a Social Security system without a minimum retirement age? It's crazy, And to give you an idea of the dimensions of the bankruptcy, I think the only one that I can think of that was more bankrupt was Greece. But even Greece had a minimum retirement age. It was 50, but it's now you have a minimum retirement age. Wasn't the optimal, but now you have that, and that's extraordinary. And just to give you the dimensions, the current deficit of the Social Security system, both the public sector and the private sector, is 4.25% of GDP. Brazil is younger than Canada, it's younger than the United States, it's younger than all these countries where you still have either balance or surplus if you have the purely pay as you go. The United States just kind of slipped into deficit just now. But it's extraordinarily bankrupt. And they went for a very audacious reform. It's not optimal, it doesn't solve the problem, but it sure goes a long way. And this is where we had the other dynamic in Congress, actually, and that's where you get this competition. So, basically they did it like the budget. The Brazilian budget, the budget's there, you have to figure out how to get there. You can change how you get there, the targets for deficit and things, but you can't change the number. They put R1 trillion into the budget for the Social Security, and that's what they came out with. And there's still some finagling around with the Senate right now, but this is really extraordinary. So that was the number one challenge. The second one is the wage bill, and it's just as big as Social Security. The wage bill in Brazil, prior to the PT government, you had this huge expansion, not only of public sector enterprises, but also of the wage bill and employment. They have to cut these things. And they're trying to do it by changing the minimum wage law to make inflation sort of deteriorate, although inflation is very low. But it is a big deal. And there is legislation in place. You can get rid of people in the public sector. It's just a rather long process now. It used to be impossible, but now it's a long process. Finally, let me sum it just on this part, and I'll talk about privatization. These two things are not only important at the federal level, but they're extremely important at the state level. The state, they worked on fiscal rules for many years, and it was culminated in the fiscal responsibility law of 2000. But these were actually, this grew out of debt contracts, renegotiated debts between the federal government and the states. And it looks like they had created a fairly ironclad fiscal, federalist type of system. And that was chipped away and chipped away and chipped away, and then now the states are back in really bad shape. So all of these things affect the states, both the Social Security, which luckily the Senate is putting back the state part in, which is extremely good, and second, in terms of wage bill, et cetera. So you still have a lot of negotiation with Congress and even the Supreme Court on this. But these are things that Brazil should have tackled 30 years ago, and now they are, which is very good. In terms of privatization, it's really, I don't think it's all that slow. They've already started. I calculated back in March, and it looks like it was pretty exact, that the public sector has about 88.5 billion US dollars of assets they can sell now. That includes 28 billion at the BNDES. They've already sold about $9 billion. That's hard to tell because of valuation fluctuations. There's this thing called the excess oil transfer rights. There's a long story about Petrobras found 13 billion barrels more when they had this concession for 5 years. That's about $31 billion, but they're going to now transfer 30% to the states. That's okay. You have the Electrobras privatization that is also about to be passed by Congress. And you have a number of other liquid assets that they can liquidate pretty much right away. So that's a pretty big number. It's not enough to affect debt to GDP ratios to the same effect that we saw in the 1990s. But we did have a very big effort by Cardoso at that time, and that came out to $83.5 billion. I did the same exercise then, I got 555.4. So these are conservative numbers, and it's already started. They've already announced the privatization of other companies, but these companies are not ready yet for privatization. But the things that we counted that are ready to go, we already have quite a bit. So you have a number of things. The only risk, the big risk there is that Congress finds out about it. I think that's really quiet about it, because the last time we had a huge privatization under Cardoso, Congress relaxed reforming. That's why we didn't get a minimum retirement age, and the reform stopped, and then suddenly they went back into fiscal problems. So it's pretty encouraging, I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's that balance between some of the risks and the opportunities, but also on the negative and the positive side of news coming out of Brazil. And you could easily get lost in those negative news without seeing what positive stories are coming out and some of the changes that could be quite long-lasting and structural. One thing, just to move forward and what to expect in our outlook, confidence has been somewhat volatile over the last 12 months, and latest data coming out of Brazil is showing some signs of weakening. And as the panelists have mentioned, most forecasters have been revising their outlooks downwards for 2019 and 2020. But looking past the recent data, what can we expect moving forward, in terms of the political outlook, in terms of the economy, and what about the reforms, given that the real shift in the way that politics is being done? What can we expect? And Chris, I'll ask if you could kick off that conversation.
Yeah, I think that in terms of looking at the legislative agenda, a couple things jump out. I mean, the first one, and is really a debate on tax reform. That's like I mentioned briefly in my initial comments. But there are two proposals for tax reform right now that overhaul the federal, state, and local value-added taxes. One in the lower house, one in the Senate. The one in the lower house is the one that most people are paying attention to and has support from the leading economists in Brazil. Governors, for the first time, have backed it, and this is actually new. Usually, when you talk about reforming the state-based value-added tax, the ICMS, it's a food fight between governors over who wins and loses. But now I think we've gotten to a point where the governors have already gone through the cycle of lowering the state-based value-added tax to attract industry. They're prohibited from giving new incentives. The state of São Paulo got in the game. They started lowering their taxes. The other governors have gotten scared, because if the richest state in the union is lowering their taxes to attract industry, those rules don't advantage them. And so the governors are supporting substituting the 5 VAT taxes into one national tax on services. It would be a huge step forward in reducing the transaction cost of doing business, not only because you don't have variation across state boundaries, but also the multiplicity of different taxes. And the reason why this is going forward in Congress is because actually party leaders are seeing this as a way to benefit state and local governments that are broke, for the reason that John said. So that that could be a little bit of a carrot to get this done. And then the economic team is about to send their proposal to Congress to lower corporate income tax, compensate that by taxing dividends, and they also want to lower personal income tax, eliminate deductions on education and health. That is the big, I would say, the big congressional debate. I think that's probably going to hit more next year in terms of out of the lower house, but this could be a potential upside surprise. Other issues on the privatization agenda, the Congress before the end of this year, I think, is going to approve a new sanitation overhaul, which allows for the privatization of state sanitation companies. Very important for the state of São Paulo, allows São Paulo to privatize Sabesp, other states to be able to move forward. So there's a really interesting privatization agenda of state governments that is going to go on. So I would echo John's words there. You're going to have central bank autonomy that can potentially be voted on. And then I think that, and then there's a lot of debate about administrative reform. But the real, I would say that the politically challenging one is to approve constitutional reforms to eliminate earmarked spending so that you can actually comply with the constitutional cap on spending for 2021. And that's delinking some politically sensitive spending programs, and you need a constitutional reform here. The challenge is that we haven't really begun this debate in Congress. It's not socialized amongst party leaders, and that's what's really keeping Pablo Gadgis, the Minister of Economy, up awake at night, because he needs to put a proposal on the table and move in this regard, right? So, I think we have a nice, year window. It's important to remember that second half of next year we have municipal elections, and then the Speaker of the lower house, Rodrigo Maia, his term as Speaker ends end of next year. We don't really know who's going to be elected Speaker of the House. His role is very important, because when you don't have a working majority and the government doesn't have a kind of a base to count on, you kind of have to have a pro-reformist leadership coming out of the Congress. So the speakership elections are going to be inordinately important, much more so than previously. So I think this is the challenge here. This is a pretty big, kind of heavy agenda. There are a lot of different moving parts, right? If we get some growth going and party leaders see a return on these reforms, then I think the risks of fiscal slippage, diminish. And then I think that institutional investors are going to really look at this agenda and say, wow, this is pretty broad and deep. To the extent that growth is low, nobody gets so excited about Brazil but I think that's, we're on the potential pivot for this, for a potential virtuous cycle here.
Yeah, I mean, weak growth does, once that confidence is reduced, and the weak growth is a self-fulfilling prophecy in this space, and politically you get concerned. And I'm delighted that you started with tax reform, because that is one of the issues that, in market constantly gets brought up as one of the biggest barriers of doing business in Brazil. And so, I'm really looking forward to see how that evolves. And so economically, and I know that there's quite a bit of discussion going on in the financial markets and in capital markets. Luis, I would like your views on how you see moving forward the economy and also any changes to capital market reform as well.
Well, here Chris is mentioning a couple of good points. One of them is public support given low growth. What most of our clients, when we visit New York and London in recent weeks, they mention what's going to happen with the spending cap. Now, the Social Security reform has tackled part of it, but the Brazilian government will not be able to sustain that process of adjustment without further measures. So the market is also watching the wage bill, possibly freezing hiring servants in the public sector, delinking some of the minimum wage increases on pensions. So those parts are key to watch going forward. Now, what else? So just to give you a sense on how much is needed for the adjustment for the next 10 years, it's around 4.2% of GDP in terms of a fiscal adjustment to be sustainable and start seeing that declining over time. This is very important for people, for clients with longer term investments. In that sense, 2% is not enough. Minimum wage, probably another percent. Freezing hirings in the public sector, another 0.4%. Delinking the minimum wage, another 1%. So these three factors going forward will be key to watch. The market so far seems to be a bit concerned whereas the Brazilian government will be able to meet such an ambitious goal. We have seen over the last 2-3 years, starting with the Temer government, some let's see, few lighting in terms of these reforms, but nothing got through in those 3 years. So now, GDP growth becomes a key point to watch. The approval, popular support, how the government is going to manage that going forward, it's key.
I can build on Luis's. I mean, also it's just important to appreciate the kind of the size of the hole that Brazil has been in, right? And I think John is kind of alluding to this. I mean, if you look at, Brazil was running a primary deficit of 2% of GDP to balance your net debt gross levels from, instead of rising on a percentage basis, you have to have a surplus of close to 2% of GDP. That's the 4% adjustment. So delivering a 1 trillion real Social Security reform of savings over the next 10 years, that gives you about, according to the Secretary of Treasury, about 1/10 of that adjustment, okay? What it does, it just stops it from getting a heck of a lot worse. So the pension reform avoided this curve of debt that was completely unsustainable, but it didn't stop the bleeding. So I think that's kind of the challenge here before us. Just a quick word on Luisa's comments, which is very important. It's just there's chatter of delinking the minimum wage, which has to be adjusted according to inflation on a yearly basis, from Social Security benefits. Our assessment, that's politically very tough, and actually the Constitutional Court may even say that that's a clausula petrius, means that you can't actually legislate over that. So that's why I think that Congress will give them some room, and they're probably going to delink some spending programs and make it some programs. But the equilibrium in Congress is we want to help to be able to maybe respect the cap, but we can't give Bolsonaro a blank check. It's really interesting. I had one party leader. I was in Brasilia 2 weeks ago, and he said, "Listen, if if this president has a lot of leeway to be able to spend on money, he's going to step on our throats the first opportunity that he has." Right? So it's kind of like they want to avoid economic, let's say, crunch, but they also don't want to give the administration so much leeway. So that's kind of the balancing act that we're likely to have in Congress.
Adding onto it, you see that in many Latin American countries, once they push one reform, then there is pressure from Congress saying, well, you now have some space to increase current expenditures. That's a problem. The luxury of increasing current expenditures going forward, which translates into lower GDP growth. So from that point of view, the market is still hesitant to be too optimistic in Brazil. You have started to see that change in that environment, but still want to see tax reform next in the pipeline. The transfers of rights is the other one that they may create some positive reaction from the market.
Let me make a comment on the growth side, because the reasons that Brazil's growth rate was lower than people were hoping are two. Number one was Argentina. You look at the manufacturing sector, industrial sector, because that's really where the weakness came. Agri-industry was okay, it was good, services were okay, consumption was decent. And it's Argentina. And you had auto exports falling almost 50% for Argentina. If you look at domestic sales of autos and other durables, they're still on a 12-month basis in double digits. So you had, for a while it was a base effect because they've been in a recession, but we're way past that base effect, and it's running on at 13% here on a 12-month basis. That's, that part is really encouraging. The second thing, now perhaps we didn't forecast enough Argentina's effect on Brazil. The second thing was the Brumadinho tailings dam collapse. That led to all the tailings dams being shut down. And that is, so if you look at the weakness in industrial production, it's intermediate goods, and that's exactly where it's from. So for those economists that were patting themselves on the back for being negative, I wish they could have told us that this was going to happen, because we might have saved some lives, But, really, when you look at the other parts of growth, it's not bad at all, especially consumption and services, and these other parts of manufacturing, durables away from intermediate goods. So I'm expecting a decent return in growth. I think the consensus now is 0.9, and I still think this year is going to be above 1. And we're starting to get these surprises on a monthly basis, especially in retail sales. But it is crucial To the question is how much of these other things contaminating expectations. So far, in the second quarter, people were surprised to have a big rebound in investment, which also tells you that the vote on Social Security had a lot to do with that, sort of people waiting a little to see what was going to happen.
That wait and see approach was definitely playing into Brazil's outlook, and you're absolutely right. Looking at fixed investment for Q2, you saw very strong performance in this space. So hopefully that continues moving forward. And I appreciate that you touched on the topic of trade, as Brazil is as you mentioned, relatively close compared to some of its other neighbors and in the region. And so I would really appreciate your views in this space, as I'm sure it's quite relevant to a room here in Canada, of what we can expect on the trade agenda with this administration.
So start.
Sure.
Yeah, if there's a nest on the ground for growth, it's trade. Because Brazil, as you said, is already closed, and then the prior administrations, along with the prior administration in Argentina, increased protectionism massively on capital goods imports, which really affected investment. The Temer administration started it, but it was a silent partner in Macri in Argentina, but now this administration is pushing for more opening. So in a simple sense, they've just reduced, and this happened under Temer, but it's been expanded, tariffs and other trade restrictions on capital goods, which immediately reduces the cost of investment, which is extremely good thing, and I think we're going to get more and more of this. Again, it's sometimes sensitive. The fact that trade is done in the foreign ministry as opposed to in the economics group makes for negotiations to be kind of more difficult. But I think what was good is that both the Macri administration and the last two administrations in Brazil have not only been outward-looking, which makes Mercosur sort of more outward-looking trade arrangement instead of what it was, which really protections. And that's really sort of helped things along. So we're finally getting to the end of negotiations with Europe, maybe with Canada, even they're trying to go with the United States. But I'll let the political side, I'll leave that for Chris to talk about.
No, I think this is one of those promising agenda that don't require congressional approval to get done, right? And obviously, when you talk about, John was absolutely correct that the Temer administration began these overtures, but not very aggressively. And the politics of opening up and trade are always slowed down by the fact that you have a lot of domestic industry that is protected by high tariffs, and they make the case: listen, we can't open the economy because we have a very high tax burden, we have a very high cost of capital, we have very onerous labor laws, and so if you open the economy, this is going to lead to destruction of kind of a number of different domestic industries. And what's new about this administration, led by the agenda by Minister of Economy Paulo Guedes, is listen, we're going to do all four simultaneously. We're going to slowly lower tariffs over the next 5 years. We're lowering the cost of capital because you deliver on pension reform, real rates are coming down. You're delivering on tax reform, something along next year. They're preparing another round of labor reform. And it's uncomfortable for a lot of kind of domestic, groups because they have the prospect of kind of, lower tariffs. And the government's plan is really to go on two tracks. The first is negotiate kind of trade agreements through Mercosur. So we have the landmark agreement with the European Union, which we think will still hold despite the fires in the Amazon and the mutual insults between Bolsonaro and Macron. You have kind of agreements being negotiated with Mexico, with Canada, with South Korea, with Singapore, talks starting in the U.S. And then the second track is they want to unilaterally lower tariffs independent of these trade agreements. And the way that you do that is that you have to reform the common external tariff within Mercosur, because a member of Mercosur can't lower tariffs on, if it's not agreed upon by the customs union. And so the idea is to lower the common external tariff, which is on average 20%, and then Brazil wants to then lower the tariffs on their own. The challenge is Argentina, right? Because you had a partner in a free trade partner in Argentina that were running around signing free trade agreements and agreement on the TACI, that the common external tariff, and now, well, what happens if Alberto Fernandez, when he gets inaugurated in December, which is highly likely. So I think that here the good news is the Brazilians, the viewers, said, listen, if Argentina doesn't want to play ball on this trade opening agenda, our threat of leaving Mercosur should be seen as credible. And I think that actually is a credible threat. It's not, and that would be, so the Argentines don't want that, okay? That would be a big hit in the context where Argentina has to go through a renegotiation of the deal with the IMF. The good news, I think, is that you can have an off-ramp for Argentina. You can have an agreement on a common external tariff in which Argentina takes 20 years to lower their tariffs and Brazil can do it quickly in 5. So in other words, there's a way to accommodate Argentina without forcing them to open their economy, going through an economic and political difficulty of, with a debt crisis next year. So you can still work within the Mercosur framework, you have that wiggle room. So I think that kind of agenda is coming. I think it's going to be a slow reduction of tariffs, and this is an administration that is keen on signing these agreements. So I would look, at least from the Brazilian side, kind of an agreement with Canada would be in one of the have the support, and the ministry, and the difference, the Ministry of Economy is having more of a run on it now because they eliminated the Ministry of Industry and Trade and Commerce, and they kind of put it within the Ministry of Economy. So the guy who's leading this is Marcos Trujillo, who works for Paulo Guedes, right? So you have kind of the economy ministry kind of driving a free trade agenda. So that's it's a slow moving story, but I think it's a meaningful one.
I would only add that Uruguay and Paraguay would be very pleased at this.
Yes.
Because they've been pushing for this for years, but they just didn't have enough weight. They're threatening all the time Uruguay to leave Mercosur because the common external tariff was too high. So they won't make that much of a difference, but certainly you can get support from that.
The only thing that concerns me from this trade environment opening them is how long it's going to take. The problem is we may see the European Union with Mercosur being signed, was it April, May at the earliest?
You translate the document by April or May, so the signing is like, second half of next year, yeah.
So from that point of view, the headlines are going to be driving the market response. Now, if you see dollar real spiking above 420, then you see investors panicking a little bit more on how the reforms are going to create an environment positive for their investments. What I will tell is Brazil comes from a low base, trade-wise, growth-wise. Reforms are being pushed through, even though it's slow, you're seeing some progress. So all of that has been a positive change for the Brazilian economy, and it's something to keep in mind. Yes, maybe some headline volatility, but don't be too scared about this reaction to the market, especially if you see Congress still pushing the reform agenda.
That's right. And actually a perfect segue when we're really talking about what are the opportunities for Canadian companies, for example, wanting to do business in Brazil. I would really appreciate your views on what sectors you see kind of top of mind that would provide a smoother transition into what was mentioned as a complex market, and what may be some things to keep in mind or some tips for those Canadian exporters when looking at the negative headlines, when looking at the stories around the economy and the political volatility. And so, John, if you could kick that off for us.
I think the opportunities, it's a great question, and I don't know if I'm the authority, especially to talk about Canada. It's still a mystery to me, this country.
You're American,
yes, I'm American. I lived here 5 years, but anyway, still mysterious. But I think it's more important on the investment side, especially in oil and gas and mining. Certainly, mining's been pretty open to Canadian investment. You have also investment of Brazilian companies up here. But on the oil and gas side, and we've seen this, especially the private equity part of pension funds, they're already there. You have a lot of pretty good assets that Petrobras has been selling, after the sort of debacles, and there's still quite a few there. And then when they go back to auctioning concessions, I think really that's where, there's other things too that I'm not quite as familiar with. Certainly agri-industry is a big one, but again, it's more investment and equipment. So Brazil's agri-industry revolution's been, almost a miracle. I mean, it's not a miracle because you can see it happen, but the productivity gains that they've had, and not on the extensive margin. This doesn't mean clearing new land or anything like that. It's just the productivity gains were so extraordinary, and it's been a great market for both Canadian and American companies that are already there, like Caterpillar, et cetera. I think those are the most immediate ones. And then if you go, when it goes a little bit further, then as Brazil opens and the things that were highly protected that didn't make sense exporting for more like consumer goods or other investment goods, especially investment goods.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would highlight three from a policy point of view. I mean, it's hard for me to say as growth, resumes, maybe there might be some sectors that are more consumer driven that could be a real interesting one, but since I'm a political wonk and where do I see policymakers focused on that I would highlight, I would say the first one is exactly what John said, oil and gas. And here it's also just to look at Brazil, if you look at Brazil, oil production right now is at 2.7 million barrels of oil per day. We're going to have a doubling of oil production over the next 20 years and potentially peaking at 7 million barrels of oil per day looking at production in the pre-salt. So deep water oil production in Brazil is probably one of the most promising offshore plays globally. And the government is very focused on trying to open up the gas market to, when you have all this associated gas that comes with this, more than doubling of oil production. And if you look at the price of gas in Brazil, it's like $9 per BTU. In the US is $2. Europe is what, 5, 6? So the idea is that you want to harmonize a regulatory framework amongst the state governments that have a control over distribution so that you can have private investments in gas distribution and lower the gas price. So the government's very focused on that. They're negotiating with the main markets. They're making progress on it. And they're finding ways forward that don't require Congress. And that also has Petrobras selling their assets. That's going to be, an area of a lot of opportunity. That's number one. Number two, logistics infrastructure. Okay, so there have been improvements in the regulatory frameworks and, rail infrastructure, highway, auctions, port and airport infrastructure. They're picking up the pace of auctions in those 4 verticals. And they're looking to approve 3 pieces of legislation that can help the regulatory framework for PPPs, rail regulatory framework, and also environmental licensing. And so when we look at the pace of private investments in logistics infrastructure, it should really start picking up at the end of this government, but it will really hit more of the next government. And the third, and I'll just throw it back to you, John, at some point, just to talk about financial services, right? The central bank is real interesting agenda, what they call this, BC hashtag, to try to be able to lower bank spreads, increase competition in financial services, foment the development of fintechs. The central bank governor is very committed with this agenda. It's not talked about it much, but when you listen to the central bank governor talk, he talks more about this and he talks about the overnight lending rate, right? So this could have important repercussions as well. And I know that John, you're better positioned to comment on this than I am. But those are kind of the 3 areas that I would see from a policy point of view, that could have repercussions. And by the way, if you take at least the first 2 seriously, that's kind of a reason to be bullish on Brazil a little bit further out because, the boom in oil production and revenue and investments is going to hit the next government, and also the private cycle of investments in logistics infrastructure. So they're not going to really help growth the next 2 years. I think you kind of have to hold the course and hold the line. But I'm convinced that the next administration is going to have those 2 favorable tailwinds behind them.
Just a couple of lines on what Chris just said. In terms of infrastructure investment, you also have the lower tariffs in capital goods. So taking a longer term perspective makes more sense to be more positive on the infrastructure, overall development on the oil part of the equation as well.
I found that with real estate. When I was up here, now Luis gets to do all these kind of simulations. You have so many pension funds here that are invested in real estate companies like Brookfield. And one of the exercises I got to do that he has to do now, under normal times, basically Canada is a perfect hedge against the Brazilian real. So I have to say, okay, what's your best case, base case, and your worst case? And they were all the same every time. It was like against the U.S. dollar. I get my dollar Brazil and Luis's dollar Brazil forecast, dollar CAD, and you come up with the middle, and they all corresponded, until of course you got some not so very good policy and things that merged them. But and then to your point, I wrote my dissertation on Brazilian financial development, the reforms that the current governor's grandfather put in place, and they have the same name, so his says Neto at the end. I knew I was expecting this, and the basic thing when I was doing my dissertation was the basic thing. Spreads in Brazil are incredible. The base rate is at 5.5%, probably going to 5. You're still getting charged on overdraft at 300% equivalent. You know, and even with these declines in rates, it didn't come down. The mystery is we don't really know why. We know some of why. Some of it's high reserve requirements that they're reducing, which they've tried to do, and trying to get a positive credit. They just finally passed a positive credit in Brazil. Basically, their credit agency was, if you ever bounce a check, you were on a blacklist. That was it. You have no ability to improve your credit. A number of things in terms of regulatory. But once you get rid of those, there's this other part of the spread that we don't. We thought it was because of the oligopolistic structure, but there was a lot of foreign banks that went into Brazil over the last 40 years. And then they left. Only a few of them have stayed there because they just can't compete with the locals. So this is a bit of a mystery, and Roberto Campos thinks that fintech is the future. And that's, and it's, I won't go any further because I've been here all day, but it's worth going on to the Central Bank website and taking a look at what they're planning to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Being in Brazil in May and meeting with the banks, I think that was a top subject of the evolution of fintech in Brazil and the outlook in that space, and particularly also on the logistics side, you know, covering the agriculture sector. And you see that if you look at Brazil compared to one of its largest competitors, the U.S. in terms of soy, it's twice the amount in transportation costs than in the U.S. And so if you look at those opportunities and you think, okay, well, what could really help not just the economy, but these specific sectors, the competitiveness of these sectors, you know, you're touching on a lot of opportunities that could provide that boost for Brazil just by tweaking the system a little bit. So thank you for providing those great ideas of opportunities, and start thinking of your questions, as we're going to be moving into questions in not too long. But I would also like to touch on just some key last points that you would like the audience to walk away on, and thinking of Brazil, the economics, the politics, the regulatory framework. And now that we've got a good sense of how we've arrived at this point and what we can expect moving forward, what should businesses keep in mind moving forward? And Chris, if I could ask you to kick that off.
Yeah, let me. I think the one thing just to put on the table, and maybe we can talk on Q&A, is let's look a little bit further out and think about what are the election risks in Brazil, right? I mean, you look at we had a heavy electoral calendar in the region over the past 2 or 3 years, and a lot of leftist governments were kicked out, right? You had Macri being elected in Argentina, you had Pedro Pablo Kuczynski in Peru, you had Ivan Duque in Colombia, Sebastián Piñera in Chile, Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's like, okay, voters are getting more pragmatic, moderate, they're kicking out their irresponsible policies to the left. Yay, we have, here we go off to the races on business-friendly environment. But, then you had the election in Argentina, and you had the surprise, thrashing of, Alberto Fernandez and the return of the Peronists. And it's like, I think the one thing to appreciate is that the election cycle that we saw over the past 2 or 3 years in Latin America was not an election cycle of kicking out the left because voters had become more pragmatic and market-oriented. It's just that they were angry at incumbents, and the left happened to be in office more than the right. And we're still in a difficult public opinion environment. You look at governments across the region, they have very low approval ratings. The honeymoon is almost non-existent. It has to do with satisfying very kind of new middle-class demands, right? The voters are angry about security, healthcare, education. These are very difficult issues to deliver. They care about corruption. And so I think that when you look at the next cycle of elections, they will be competitive. This is not, incumbents are not riding the wave of commodity boom. So is there a risk of the left coming back into office in Brazil? Yes, Now, what I would just say is that I think Bolsonaro is actually relatively well-positioned because he has a base of support, about 20-30%, that his kind of ideological base. And if growth picks up, like most people expect, he's going to finish his mandate on kind of a positive delta. And so, he's now at 41-44% approval ratings. He can dip and still recover in time to win a re-election. So I think that the risk of the left coming back in Brazil is there. This is a difficult public opinion environment, but I actually think that Bolsonaro is better positioned than even many local pundits appreciate.
And I'll just, a little plug, Chris was one of the very few of us who forecasted a Bolsonaro administration winning, and so I guess we could see that as a positive forecast moving forward. And your views, Luis, on some top topics to keep in mind.
Just adding into what Chris said, of course, governance is a key point to watch, but also in terms of around the region, how Congress is how fragmented Congress is and how well Congress is supporting important reforms going forward. We've seen in the case of Peru where left or right gets elected, they never get the majority government working forward. If you have a stalemate sentiment going forward, then that's uncertainty for the market. In the case of Brazil, Congress doesn't really support Bolsonaro, but they're pushing for the reforms given the popular support for them. So now that's key to watch. Also, it's do not get too caught in the headlines driven by the external uncertainty. Yes, it creates a lot of risk for the overall economy, globally, not only in Latin America. But for example, look at Brazil. Brazil is one of the closest economies. There is a lot of correlation between what the real and the yuan are doing as of late, and that sends a panic signal to the market. The reality is that, well, Brazil is a closed economy. You shouldn't be too affected by it. And if you look at the dynamics on what's happening, growth is having a bigger impact on the overall economy than trade is having. So for example, the situation between the US and China where everyone is panicking, it should have benefited Brazil through soybeans. What happened here is also that you had the African swine fever decimating the hog production in China, which also lowered the prices of soybeans. So from that perspective, Brazil didn't get the positive out of all this mess, but opening its external accounts to more investments, and it's a positive going forward. So watch for that longer term view rather than the headlines of the external environment.
Well, what I'll be looking for certainly encompasses what both Chris and Luis have said. To me, and it was good that Luis brought up Peru, because Peru has institutionalized their economic model. There is really no discussion about the economic model whatsoever. That's why you've seen all presidents from all parts of the political spectrum keeping with a rather orthodox stance. The question here is how much will Congress, which seems to be on the reformist role, and the government be able to institutionalize. There was a lot done, but a lot of that was sort of reversed, and it took a long time. Unlike in Argentina where things were reversed, reversals kind of happened quickly. Brazil really institutionalized things. It was less personalistic. It was more in the structure, especially with fiscal responsibility law, etc. And that's also what's encouraging about trade. So I'll be looking to see if they can put back, infrastructure. There's one thing in particular that if they do it, it has to do with this transfer to the states and the balance of the states. If they can trade, helping the states with the transfer of rights revenue for getting something like the U.S. Constitution where the federal government can no longer bail out states, that would be stronger than what we had before. And what they had was pretty strong, but we saw that it was defeated. So I'll be looking at the institutionalized things. The other things, I'll be looking at growth, things like that, but I do think we're coming back. If we're disappointed, then I might have to rethink that. Those are the two main things I'll be looking at.
Great, thank you. And so if you'll allow me to throw a couple of more pointed questions, and it was brought up a little bit, but the fragmentation of Congress and a new government, there was a 50% renewal rate in Congress, and how much of that has impacted the conversation around policy and reforms. And Chris, so I would like your views specifically on that, and how much did these elections really change the way in which politics gets done in Brazil, and how do we see that moving forward? Do we see that being sustained?
Yeah. No, I think it's an absolutely fascinating period as a political scientist to study Brazilian politics, because you look at the last election, and Brazil always had a high churn on the legislature because many federal deputies would leave the lower house to run for mayor, and so the renewal rate was high, but this last election was very high. As I said, 50% of federal deputies who ran for re-election didn't win, and 75% of senators who ran for re-election didn't win. And the kind of the political class, they kind of saw, these risks coming, right, in the last government. And what they did was that they tried to protect themselves. And they tried to protect themselves by increasing the amount of money to fund campaigns, legislative campaigns, presidential campaigns. Because the Supreme Court, after the vote buying scandal, right, the massive scandal, they said companies are prohibited from giving money to political campaigns. So it dried up, and then the political class, oh my God, voters are angry at us, and we don't have our pockets in the private sector to fund our money. So they approved the legislation in Congress of 1.7 billion reais to fund the cycles of legislative and kind of gubernatorial elections. So they gave it to the major parties. So there was an expectation that these incumbents would benefit from this money and access to pork and patronage, and it didn't. Right? So I had many party leaders saying, and coming to me and say, listen, I had the most money in my party. I had appointments in the federal bureaucracy. I had amendments, and I barely got elected. And the people that got elected were the people on social media. They didn't have any money. They were newcomers, right? And so I think that so the link in Congress between if I can just get my goodies in government and resources and guarantee re-election, that was shattered in last year's election. And then you had the party system even fragmented further. So you went to 31 parties in the lower house and 21 in the Senate, right? It's the highest number of parties in the party system. So what's going to happen? I think that part of this happening is that these parties are saying, okay, how am I going to survive in this, right? That's what's going on. They're nominating new leaders, they're changing their names, and then you have they're going to have to start kind of mergers and acquisitions are going to occur amongst the party system because you did approve a political reform that increases the electoral threshold. And so I think that there's going to be a redefinition of these parties on the left, on the right, and the center. So we're probably going to have a new party system coming out of the next couple of elections. But the big question is, how long will this anger last, right? I mean, so, if growth comes back, will the anger against politicians start to abate and maybe revert back to part of the politics of the past, or are we kind of in a new equilibrium? I don't think this anger goes away very quickly because these are middle class demands that won't be met. And so I do think that we're going to have a little bit of this anger lasting for a longer period of time. But essentially this is kind of, we're in this transition period on the political system, and the big shock came with the economic and the political crisis and scandals of corruption, right? And I think that's probably where we're having a reshaping of the party system in this regard.
It is interesting to see just globally how much of an impact, negative perception of government and the institution, and how much it is shifting the conversation entirely in this space, not just in Brazil, but globally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at the kind of, this is when folks, a lot of Eurasia Group, you have this, perceptions that the system is broken, right? I mean, this is something that has gripped the European continent, gripped kind of politics in the U.S. and Canada to a certain extent, right? Trust in institutions is down. In kind of North America, Europe is about politics of immigration and distance between cosmopolitan centers and industrial heartlands. In Latin America, it's a different beast altogether. It's a new middle class that grew during the commodity period. The issues they cared about shifted, and it's corruption. I mean, those are the roots of the disenchantment. That's not going away. And you see, corruption is the number 1 or 2 issue for voters in Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Brazil, right? That's new on these election cycles.
Instead of answering, I'd rather like to ask a question. And I'll first start with a comment, and I'll ask Chris. Brazil has a structural problem with accountability in its system. Cardoso tried to change that. But unlike the United States, I still don't understand Canada, but anyway, you have congressional districts where you have to go back and face your voters. In Brazil, the lower house is elected at a statewide level, which means more important than whatever constituencies that you sit in front of, but special interest groups, unions, etc. And that is a problem that is still there, and certainly a lot of what we saw coming. Is there any chance that we'll get a sort of thinking of this kind of situation? Because the accountability, it's there, but it's been supplanted by social media, maybe Vem pra Rua or something, where they list the people as they vote, but it's not the same thing as having to go back to constituencies and say, okay, here I am, ask me questions. I don't know if you have any opinions on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate because it's sometimes, I tend to have a little bit more of of attack where I don't put the blame of Brazil's ailments as much on the electoral system, and that's weird to say as a political scientist, right? So usually, you know, when you say Brazil, it's like, oh, it's very corrupt, no accountability, there's this and that. Oh, we need political reform, right? So we need and the reason, and part of it is you have fragmented party system, in the kind of congressional districts where the border of the state governments, open list proportional representation system, so you don't have you try to campaign on your own personal reputation rather than your party, right? And so then some people say, oh, you can change that by having single member districts in Congress or a mixed system like Germany. But we do see, you know, congressional parliamentary democracies where you have multiple large electoral districts in which parties, you know, are accountable. And I think that ultimately, I think that when you have this shock like this, and the real interesting question is, will parties want to develop a reputation for what their party represents? The only party in Brazil's, let's say, party system that developed that party reputation was the Workers' Party, the PT, right? They campaigned on, I am PT, I am 13, but now we're starting to get green shoots. The Novo, some of the parties are trying to change I think we're shifting the strategy in Congress a bit. And, you know, when you have much cheaper elections, you have to develop a programmatic reputation rather than a personal reputation. So maybe I think I see some green shoots even without a political reform introducing single member districts to that. But that's you know, that's a great question though. But and I also think that sometimes when you change electoral rules, you have unintended consequences that you don't really fully foresee.
I mean, it's certainly a topic that's going to be worth watching moving forward because it's not something that really changes or shifts overnight. And so if the audience will allow me one last indulgence, one last question before I turn it over to you. I wanted to touch on a subject that's really been top of mind globally this year. You know, the environment and climate change are front and center on the global stage. And 2019 marked an important time for dialogue around this subject, and Brazil was certainly part of that conversation as well. You know, as mentioned earlier, the Paris Agreement. There were some linkages with environmental conversations with Macron. And you know, the Amazon fires garnered a lot of attention globally. And so, you know, with its vast natural resources, I'm wondering, John, if you could give us your thoughts on how you see the conversation around the environment and climate change impacting Brazil and its outlook.
Well, I hope it leads to a little bit more reasoned or level discussion. I did work on this. It's not my specialty, but when I was in graduate school, that was really when you got a huge amount of pressure on Brazil, especially Marcelo was the ambassador. I got to see him work, and I was giving a presentation in Washington, and you had this sort of thing. The problem is this really hits a raw nerve, especially among military types like the current president. Why? Because, well, everybody else already, you know, leveled their force. Why do we have to do the same thing? And still, actually, that was the reaction back then. Marcelo did a fantastic job of dealing with it. But what has happened since then in Brazil? You have local interests that have a vested interest in improving things. At the time, the main cause of the excessive deforestation was an explicit policy of the government to give fiscal subsidies because the military, during the military years, they wanted to settle, especially border regions with Roraima, et cetera, on the western side, and they weren't settled. And they thought that was a national risk, a risk to national security. That's why they created all these roads and stuff like that. They've got rid of that about 30 years ago. So the fiscal incentives to deforest are not there. And if we look at pulp and paper, there's no companies up in the Amazon in pulp and paper. Why? Because they can put a eucalyptus forest back together in 5 years in the sun, Paraná. You don't have to be up there. And actually some of the films of the burnings are actually happening down there. And then the cattle industry, it's not a great place to raise cattle. The only place where cattle actually has been very efficient is Amapá, in the northeast corner of the Amazon basin. So, and that was done fairly. The most outspoken and reasonable governor is from Amapá. Anyway, so and we look at the burnings. Okay, this happens every year. It's a dry part of the year, etc. It's illegal to burn, even for existing farmland, but it's cheaper to do it though. You got underbrush you have to clear, and it's easy to just light it up in a fire. The problem is you can't control it, and that's part of the biggest problem here. The level of burnings is at about the last 40-year average. Certainly had periods where it was much higher. So in the first decade of the 2000s, there was a number of years that were twice as high as the current building. So you had these representations starting with a very low base here, so there's a lot of things that people know. What has happened since the original sort of verbal aggressions is that now, okay, we've got to do something. It's clearly, and we've had the military send in and stuff like that. I think maybe starting with a more disciplined discourse at the beginning would save a lot of time. But it's an important thing for Brazil, not to impose everybody else's thing out, but it's an important thing. And the Amazon basin is a very important thing. I think my own view on this is that we've seen in most countries the most egregious environmental violations done when the government gets too involved. You create correct incentives. So if, we can talk about Russia and Chernobyl and stuff like that, but even in the Brazilian case, there was this really ridiculous project in the 1970s. It was a huge white elephant. It was a guy named Ludwig, the Japanese government and the Brazilian government. And his idea was to create a floating pulp mill on the Amazon where it'd move up and down, they'd reforest. The problem is, and I worked with some agronomists at the University of Illinois, that's where I did my graduate work, and they told me what had happened. They only tested the hybrids in one little part of the whole Amazon basin, and it was the only place that actually worked. Everywhere else, you clear that, it doesn't come back. And so that thing failed. It was a huge write-off for the Japanese government, the Brazilian government, and you've never seen anything like that come back again. But there's these sort of smaller incentives where you have farmers, people that have been able to move out of the big cities, get a bit of land. It looks like they're being productive. They put a cow in there, so but it's a very complex and big problem. There's all sorts of things going on, but it's really quite important. And I think we've seen the stance sort of change since the beginning. Maybe Chris will not agree with me or Luis, but this is in Brazilians' interest to deal with this in a reasonable way. And I think for the most part that we've seen since we had some really egregious policies 40 years ago, it's improved, but we certainly can get better.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that I think Johnny, I think all the points that you make are very valid. And you look at the kind of the international press coverage of the fires in the Amazon and all the chatter on social media. There's been a lot of hyperbole, a lot of kind of not appreciation of where the base has been, and understandably some Brazilians feel defensive in the fact that they're being villainized in the context where their environmental track record isn't as egregious as it would suggest, and the administration. I would just kind of make agreeing with everything you say, but I would give two caveats, which is environmental concern and anxiety is on the rise in developed countries and is here to stay, right? So you have this growing anxiety in the US and Canada and Europe. It's politically much more important. You have this diffuse anxiety that is growing. And, Bolsonaro said, you guys want a face to personify our anxieties and have the villain? Here it is. I mean, it's like he gave himself as to be the representation of everything that's for destroying the Amazon. He reacts by saying that the media is lying. He reacts by criticism from abroad by calling them as neo-colonial interests, in the region. He comes from the military, which has a long-standing conspiratorial kind of view of the world that foreign powers have their own security interests in infringing upon the Amazon, which, if you kind of listen to the military, over the past, we knew this for the past 10, 15, 20 years, right? It was kind of this dark little secret in terms of Brazilian policy circles, like, wow, I can't believe that the military actually believes that there are kind of foreign interests to be able to enter, to threaten Brazil's sovereignty. And so when you saw that, right, when Bolsonaro addressed the UN this last week, it was a defense of national sovereignty, because actually the military believes, right, that sovereignty is at risk, right? And so in other words, he did nothing, right, to placate the concerns or validate the concerns. All he did was undermine the concerns themselves. In other words, I think that Bolsonaro put himself in a position where it is a liability on the kind of international stage, because then you have consumer groups in Europe want to boycott Brazilian products. And then the other caveat is that the uptick in the fires also was driven in part by Bolsonaro's own rhetoric, right? Because he got elected on saying that there's an industry of fines on environmental issues. He protects the small kind of miner, the small agricultural producer. And so the folks on the ground in the Amazon region, they said, okay, we got a president that's not going to punish us, right? So he didn't change the legislation. It was still prohibited, but there was the expectation of not being punished increased the rate of kind of illegal fires, and then they had to call in the military to come in. So in other words, they got the genie out of the bottle, now he has to put it back in. That's the challenge from an expectations point of view. I think the military is trying to control it, so, but those are the two caveats, which I think it's hard to fully turn the corner on the expectations front on the ground. So I think that the rate of fires will probably be above average in comparison to the low base, but that's partially his own making, right? So that there's a little culpability there, but it's not going to go away. I fear that when the fire season comes back next year, this may be another. Brazil will be on the defensive again, and Bolsonaro will not react well, to those criticisms again. So that's just how he got elected. He's not going to abandon that.
Just to add a couple of points on there, I agree completely with what Chris just said. In terms of how investors look at the overall environment, the environmental issues, do you think this is going to add another layer of worries to the approval of the European Union Mercosur agreement, especially if they come back at the same time as the fires resurface next year?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Macron obviously was playing politics as well, right? He found an issue that played with his base. The agricultural caucus was never all that happy with the EU Mercosur agreement to begin with. And so I think that, what I hear from EU officials is, so you translate the document, you'll finish it by April or May next year, right? And then the dry season starts to pick up again July and August. So I think that the European Commission wants to put this to a vote. They can time the vote so they don't put it to a vote when there's a, flash of concern, so they can actually hold it back. There seems to be enough interest in favor of the deal, even amongst French kind of industry that benefits a lot. They're big foreign direct investors, so it looks like it's gonna be on track. But it's the kind of thing that can get in the way, right? I think that most of the foreign ministries think it'll get done, but again, if environmental issues start to grow and continue to grow and the national stage, and these things matter, right? And just that Bolsonaro's rhetoric and the defensiveness on sovereignty and disqualifying international media, and he just, again, it's like, let me be the villain you were looking for, right? It generates a lot of anxiety of big agro business, because they're like, we don't want this. We're not infringing upon the Amazon for deforestation. You have a lot of cultivatable land in the center west of the country. Pulp and paper there. I mean, a lot of Brazilian industries are just like, oh my God, we have to communicate a better image abroad, right? And that's the kind of, but what the president says matters, right? So.
Absolutely. I think that communication of that image is going to be key, particularly for these sectors that do get a lot of attention. And so that gives us a lot to think about, and I'm sure the audience is looking forward to getting some insights from your questions. And so turning over to the audience, if I could ask you to state your name and your affiliation, and please, yes.
So I'm Peter Hawkins with BCCC. I would like you to create a commercial for Brazil.
Peter?
Oh, sorry.
I'm Peter Hawkins with the BCCC. I would like you to create a commercial for Brazil. Please tell us what the message should be.
For me? Well, I think that ultimately, I think that the message has to be that forget the noise, right? Because there's a lot of noise on Bolsonaro and the rhetoric, and look at the action, right? And if you look at the action, starting from Temer, approval of labor reform, approval of constitutional cap on spending, opening of the oil and gas sector, pension reform, opening financial services, tax reform coming, trade opening coming, right? So I think that maybe the motto, I'm just thinking off the cuff of my head, is action speaks louder than words, right? So look at the action and don't get fooled by the noise, right? Because this is a real interesting juxtaposition of highly polarized politics, of which a president was elected on this. He will continue to have this polarizing politics. He will generate enemies in Congress. He will buy fights, on the international stage. He is not going to moderate because it's not politically in his interest to. And why would you change, right? You got elected with no money, no television time, no support from everyone. You get to the presidential office, what do you expect him to act like a statesman? No, it's not. Bolsonaro is not that. He's being true to who he was and how he got there, right? So the polarizing politics and negative headlines will continue. But I think that, if you look at the track record and where we're headed, it looks a heck of a lot better. That would be kind of my, my 2 cents.
I'll agree completely with Chris here. I will just put the picture on what the market was expecting at the beginning of the year and what happened so far this year, right? So we have, some check marks. Okay, the pension reform, the social security reform has gone through. You have the tax reform coming next, trade opening agenda. Growth is the only thing that is missing, but the government has set up the groundwork for this to come through.
How about Brazil moving into modernity? And Brazil is confronting things that a lot of G7 countries haven't dealt with yet, including Social Security. I'm not expecting anything from the U.S. government. Put it that way.
It's funny, like for you to be, it's like, all of us who've been following Brazil for so long, right? There's a saying in Brazil that Brazil is the country of the future, and it always will be, right? And my former advisor, kind of mentor in Brazil, Mailson Danóbrega, he was a partner at a private consulting firm, former Minister of Finance. He wrote a book about 5 years ago, and he said the future is now. Probably a little bit too early to have called the turn, right? But there are, I think that the structural factors are pointing in a constructive cycle. The issue is whether we can get off the rails with low growth and difficult politics. I don't think we will, but I think it's pointing in the right direction.
Christopher, hi, I'm here. How are you? So my name is Patricia. I want to ask you. I know we're listening about the boycotting products from Brazil. Right now, or there is speculation because of this crisis about Amazon. And what do you think, or from your perspective, about what Brazil going to do to solve this problem and attract business or people to want to invest in Brazil?
I'd say just real quick, the first thing you need to do is you just have to bring the rate of fires down on a comparative basis. And actually, the month of September, it has come down. You look at the military, they declared an emergency decree. The military went in. They tried to be able to combat some of those fires. So the month of September data is looking actually lower, even in comparison to the low base of the previous couple of years. So that's good news. The address to the United Nations didn't help. But I think that if you have that data coming in, and then we're going to get into the rainy season, so this is it's going to die down, right? October, November, and then we're going to have to, there's going to have no data until next year, at the beginning of the Northern Hemisphere summer. So then I think the real issue is, can the government prevent the same thing that happened this year, next year, right? I think the rhetoric from the administration, unfortunately, Brazil's not going to do a good political communication job on the environment, just by who Bolsonaro is. So you're going to be hamstrung on that. So then you just got to hope that the data doesn't look as bad. I think it's going to be better than this year, but it's hard to turn the expectations game entirely.
I would add, maybe not coming from him, because people thought that he would address this, but Brazil is way under its targets, especially its carbon targets. They have so much headroom. They are outperforming all of the agreements, the Paris Accord agreements, by a huge margin. And I couldn't really say that for all the countries that signed on to that thing, for a good portion of it, by the way. And that was what didn't come out.
Yeah.
That was hoping. It's really extraordinary. Brazil is outperforming these things. So we've had an increase in fires and stuff like that, but certainly that Brazil's performance on these things is quite good. And they should be emphasizing that and then prepare for next year. Get ready, don't let this thing happen, and it's every year at this time. We've seen it other places. It was had quite a fit in the sort of the time of year, and in Africa you have massive fires, but it's some of it's accidental, and Bolsonaro did talk about it. Some of it's because of the dry season, and some of it's criminal, and they are working to get rid of the criminality, and that's how effectively they're doing it. I don't know, but it seems like now with the internal attention, they're really starting to impose things. There's a number of things that happen. There's a lot of invasions of federal land, things like that. The question is, one of the things there is that if farmers invade federal and start logging, any equipment that is supposed to be burned. If the federal police come, they just have to light it up with smoke. The question is whether they're actually doing that or not. But there's, a little bit more talk about the implementation, not necessarily from. The other thing that Brazil has, it really has state-of-the-art following of this through this different satellite networks in IBAMA. And you can get on the website and look at it. You can see what's going on. So I think that's the other thing, some of the things the president has done to sort of cast a question on IBAMA. But IBAMA is really quite impressive at what they can do. So the information's there.
Absolutely, and there's an element of separating, the criminality and then the agribusiness or different areas that are, working completely within the legal terms. So how do you separate those two and then tell that story as well, communicate what's going on the ground, I think is going to be important as well.
Terry Boylan, CPQI. I suppose my question is more for Louise. We've seen with the Brazilian economic environment deteriorating, and particularly with the circumstances in Argentina and the destruction of the Argentinian peso over the course of the last few months following the disastrous primary elections for President Macri, that the Brazilian real has suffered a lot and currently stands at 4.15. However, there has been good news over recent weeks, and whilst there was a small improvement in the real, it seems to be going in the wrong direction again. So I suppose from an economic perspective, and for the companies here that do cross-border business, where's your view on the medium to long-term Brazilian real against the dollar, and why?
Well, I'll just give you a caveat, right? Forecasting currencies over the long to medium term is almost impossible in this environment. But just to talk about perception on the Argentina situation, of course Brazil has been contaminated. It was a major offset from the primaries. However, Argentina has been isolated from the rest of the world for quite a long time. Growth has remained low. So from the point of view on how that impacts economically to Brazil through the external accounts, the impact may be limited. Now, the perception on how these threats on politics affects the Brazilian economy through maybe some problems with Mercosur and the Brazil tried to leave it may have created a volatility at the start of almost 2 months ago. What we see, the real is actually improving. If you look at the measures in terms of fundamentals and look at the current account, external account numbers, you get a sense that the Brazilian real is still undervalued 7%. So from that point of view, it gives you an exchange rate of around 3.85 to 3.90, which is where we're expecting, given the improvement in the social security reform and the tax reform coming next.
And I'll just touch on, if you look at the real over the long term and you look at its real value, it's actually been quite stable over the last 20, 30 years. And so it's this political and domestic volatility that comes in and adds a bit of that noise. But generally speaking, I mean, if you were to look at Brazil in the long term, which is one of the key messages I think coming out of this panel, is if you're looking at long term, then you do have a lot more stability than it might appear in the current moment. Any other questions? Don't be shy.
Good afternoon, my name is David Stevenson and I'm the CEO of Lithium One Environmental. Thank you very much to the panel today, very informative. We're a nano extraction company specifically for the lithium and mining industry. We can also address tailing pond cleanup. And so I guess my question to you, and I'm not at the Nanotech conference delegation down south right now, but my question to the panel is, what obstacles do you think are facing companies, not just for my specific company, but for clean tech and green tech in general? The obstacles.
I mean, the ones that the economists focus on more are sort of general. So Chris talked about the tax thing, because tax burden is quite high. It's all kind of indirect taxes, but the real question is, I was encouraged, probably for the first time in your comments, that actually tax reform could get done. And they're running into some problems there, but the tax situation is quite difficult. You enter the courts. It takes a very long time to win a case. Now, I just happened to win a case. It took 10 years, but I actually won. I'm making light of it, but it's a big deal. Brazil is very legalistic, which is a good thing, because typically there is recourse and there's something where in the law. It just takes the courts a mammoth amount of time to get things done. And there tend to be letter of the law as opposed to spirit of the law, which has its drawbacks, because then people game the law and stuff like that. So that's sort of one of the things about the congressional districts. The politician would game the law the minute it went in place. But you do have recourse, although it takes 10 years to get things done. So that, I would think those, and also the myriad of protectionist things that are there. So the tax system in general, not only the foreign trade tax system, which hopefully we'll see some progress on, but also the tariff thing, which we are seeing progress on. And the legal situation, it's a bit of a mixed bag, because you look at other countries like Mexico, it takes less time now than it used to. There it's the spirit and the letter. You look at other countries that have gone much further in terms of making it easier for businesses to get a resolution in the courts, like Peru and Chile. But it is, Brazil is moving that way. But these still remain barriers. I think the other things that Brazil has an advantage of, they have a very active managerial market. So that really is the offspring of the old capital markets reform back in the 60s. Actually, Brazil has a market for control, which you don't see in I don't think any other country in Latin America. So, you really have a very dynamic business sector on those fronts. And then the high cost of capital, just very high.
What I would add, and maybe I'm again trying to tease out some repercussions that I see from the policy side, maybe from your sector specifically, is you would think that, after what happened in Budomaginu and, the catastrophe on the tailpipe, this could be a tremendous opportunity for anybody who has solutions from a kind of, green technology, for the industry. You have Congress having 2 congressional hearings, one in the Senate, one in the lower house, of proposals how to react to Budomaginu, and kind of environmental, let's say greater safety regulations, environmental licensing, funds to clean up and protect consumers. But what John just said here about the judiciary is important, right? Because what it means is, you look at the kind of the speed at which Congress is deliberating on specific proposals from Budomaginu was taking longer than you would have appreciated. You have a lot of industry and kind of sector-specific interests. The reconciliation of the Senate and lower house hasn't been quick. And then you have a lot of this being litigated in courts, right? So I just fear that the kind of, for existing mining players, that's not a bad equilibrium, because it just means that the policy repercussions are not as immediate, but it just means that you don't have these are the new rules and we're off to the races. If you have, a lot of these issues still making their way through the litigation in courts, it just slows down that potential upside that maybe you would see in the mining sector for greener technology to fix that issue. But that said, that was a huge political issue. I mean, and it still remains one. There could be other, kind of dams that could potentially, kind of become issues going forward.
From a point of view, just touching base on what John said, is mostly cutting the red tape, right? It's too many regulatory processes in Brazil for firms to establish themselves more there. That's the same problem that most of Latin American countries have. So that's that's key in the macroeconomic reforms coming up.
One final thing on the green, this is not my specialty. But I am the head of a charity back in New York that's dedicated to Latin America. Environment has become a very big thing. So we have some very good counterparties from Brazil. And I remember, I'm getting old, but 40 years ago, I think Brazil's made massive strides on the environmental front. Not only from a pollution standpoint, but from implementing technologies that are much more friendly in any way, whether it's they were advanced sort of by accident because of ethanol. So when I was a kid in São Paulo, it was the worst place to live in terms of air pollution in the world. And when ethanol came in, you suddenly have a much better air quality since then. And you've seen it happen in other parts of Latin America, and it's really been domestically based. So the question is should the government come in with some kind of big incentives or things like that? I think maybe some kind of tax deduction or something, which they do have. But they had explicit subsidies under the prior administration. Something along the lines where the market kind of figures its way to this type of technology. But there's pretty good, and again, there's a lot more people here that could talk about this. But that's my perception of sort of 40 years. We've had a really huge improvement in environmental quality overall in Brazil. There's certain specifics that aren't quite that way, but compared to the 1970s, it's a huge difference.
And so I think that is all the time we have, unless we have one burning question coming from the audience. No?
No fires here.
No fires, good. So that is all the time we have. And so just to summarize, and I'll be selfish in this here, I think the three big points that I wanted to bring up as a conclusion to this discussion was really look at Brazil in the long term. From a policy perspective, things are moving. There's a lot happening in the market, and there's a lot of opportunities within that. And so I think is really leveraging your partners, leveraging not just the knowledge, but also different partners, both locally and here in Canada. And so on that note, I wanted to thank Luis, Chris, and John for their time, and thank you for your attention.